Edward VIII, Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, 23rd of June 1894 to 28th of May 1972, later known as the Duke of Windsor, was King of the United Kingdom and the dominions of the British Empire and Emperor of India from the 20th of January 1936 until his abdication in December of the same year. Edward was born during the reign of his great-grandmother Queen Victoria as the eldest child of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George V and Queen Mary. He was created Prince of Wales on his 16th birthday, 7 weeks after his father succeeded as king. As a young man, Edward served in the British Army during the First World War and undertook several overseas tours on behalf of his father. The Prince of Wales gained popularity due to his charm and charisma, and his fashion sense became a hallmark of the era. After the war, his conduct began to give cause for concern. He engaged in a series of sexual affairs that worried both his father and then British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. Upon his father's death in 1936, Edward became the second monarch of the House of Windsor. The new king showed impatience with court protocol and caused consternation among politicians by his apparent disregard for established constitutional conventions. Only months into his reign, a constitutional crisis was caused by his proposal to marry Wallis Simpson, an American who had divorced her first husband and was seeking a divorce from her second. The prime ministers of the United Kingdom and the Dominions opposed the marriage, arguing a divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands was politically and socially unacceptable as a prospective queen consort. Additionally, such a marriage would have conflicted with Edward's status as titular head of the Church of England, which, at the time, disapproved of remarriage after divorce if a former spouse was still alive. Edward knew the Baldwin government would resign if the marriage went ahead, which could have forced a general election and would have ruined his status as a politically neutral constitutional monarch. When it became apparent he could not marry Simpson and remain on the throne, he abdicated. He was succeeded by his younger brother, George VI. With a reign of 326 days, Edward was one of the shortest reigning British monarchs to date. After his abdication, Edward was created Duke of Windsor. He married Simpson in France on the 3rd of June 1937, after her second divorce became final. Later that year, the couple toured Nazi Germany, which fed rumors that he was a Nazi sympathizer. During the Second World War, Edward was at first stationed with the British military mission to France, but after the fall of France was appointed governor of the Bahamas. After the war, Edward spent the rest of his life in France. He and Wallis remained married until his death in 1972. They had no children. Tupuk early life. Edward was born on the 23rd of June 1894 at White Lodge, Richmond Park, on the outskirts of London during the reign of his great-grandmother Queen Victoria. He was the eldest son of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George III and Queen Mary. His father was the son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, later King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. His mother was the eldest daughter of Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge and Francis, Duke of Teck. At the time of his birth, he was third in the line of succession to the throne, behind his grandfather and father. Edward was baptized Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David in the Green Drawing Room of White Lodge on the 16th of July, 1894, by Edward White Benson, Archbishop of Canterbury. The name Edward was chosen in honor of Edward's late uncle, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, who was known within the family as Eddie, Edward being among his given names. Albert was included at the behest of Queen Victoria for her late husband Albert. Prince Consort Christian was in honor of his great-grandfather, King Christian IX of Denmark, and the last 4 names, George, Andrew, Patrick, and David, came from, respectively, the patron saints of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. He was always known to his family and close friends by his last given name, David, as was common practice with upper-class children of the time. Edward and his younger siblings were brought up by nannies rather than directly by their parents. One of Edward's early nannies often abused him by pinching him before he was due to be presented to his parents. His subsequent crying and wailing would lead the Duke and Duchess to send him and the nanny away. The nanny was discharged after her mistreatment of the children was discovered, and she was replaced by Charlotte Bill, Edward's father, though a harsh disciplinarian, was demonstratively affectionate, and his mother displayed a frolicsome side with her children that belied her austere public image. She was amused by the children making tadpoles on toast for their French master as a prank, and encouraged them to confide in her. Undertook. Education. Initially, Edward was tutored at home by Helene Bricca. When his parents traveled the British Empire for almost 9 months following the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, young Edward and his siblings stayed in Britain with their grandparents, Queen Alexandra and King Edward VII, who showered their grandchildren with affection. Upon his parents' return, Edward was placed under the care of 2 men, Frederick Finch and Henry Hansel, who virtually brought up Edward and his siblings for their remaining nursery years. Edward was kept under the strict tutorship of Hansel until almost 13 years old. Private tutors taught him German and French. Edward took the examination to enter the Royal Naval College, Osborne, and began there in 1907. Hansel had wanted Edward to enter school earlier, but the prince's father had disagreed. Following 2 years at Osborne College, which he did not enjoy, Edward moved on to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. A course of 2 years, followed by entry into the Royal Navy, was planned. Edward automatically became Duke of Cornwall and Duke of Rothesay on the 6th of May 1910, when his father ascended the throne as George IV on the death of Edward VII. He was created Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester a month later on the 23rd of June 1910, his 16th birthday. Preparations for his future as king began in earnest. He was withdrawn from his naval course before his formal graduation, served as midshipman for 3 months aboard the battleship Hindustan, then immediately entered Magdalen College, Oxford, for which, in the opinion of his biographers, he was underprepared intellectually. A keen horseman, he learned how to play polo with the university club. He left Oxford after 8 terms without any academic qualifications. Prince of Wales. Edward was officially invested as Prince of Wales in a special ceremony at Carnarvon Castle on the 13th of July 1911. The investiture took place in Wales at the instigation of the Welsh politician David Lloyd George, Constable of the Castle and Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Liberal government. Lloyd George invented a rather fanciful ceremony in the style of a Welsh pageant and coached Edward to speak a few words in Welsh. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Edward had reached the minimum age for active service and was keen to participate. He had joined the Grenadier Guards in June 1914, and although Edward was willing to serve on the front lines, Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, refused to allow it, citing the immense harm that would occur if the heir apparent to the throne were captured by the enemy. Despite this, Edward witnessed trench warfare firsthand and visited the front line as often as he could, for which he was awarded the Military Cross in 1916. His role in the war, although limited, made him popular among veterans of the conflict. He undertook his first military flight in 1918 and later gained a pilot's license. Edward's youngest brother, Prince John, died at the age of 13 on the 18th of January 1919 after a severe epileptic seizure. Edward, who was 11 years older than John and had hardly known him, saw his death as little more than a regrettable nuisance. He wrote to his mistress of the time that he had told her all about that little brother and how he was an epileptic. John's been practically shut up for the last 2 years anyhow, so no one has ever seen him except the family, and then only once or twice a year. This poor boy had become more of an animal than anything else. He also wrote an insensitive letter to his mother, which has since been lost. She did not reply, but he felt compelled to write her an apology, in which he stated, "I feel such a cold-hearted and unsympathetic swine for writing all that I did. No one can realize more than you how little poor Johnny meant to me who hardly knew him. I feel so much for you, darling Mama, who was his mother." In 1919, Edward agreed to be president of the organizing committee for the proposed British Empire exhibition at Wembley Park, Middlesex. He wished the exhibition to include a great national sports ground, and so played a part in the creation of Wembley Stadium. Throughout the 1920s, Edward, as Prince of Wales, represented his father at home and abroad on many occasions. His rank, travels, good looks, and unmarried status gained him much public attention. At the height of his popularity, he was the most photographed celebrity of his time, and he set men's fashion. During his 1924 visit to the United States, Menswear magazine observed, "The average young man in America is more interested in the clothes of the Prince of Wales than in any other individual on earth." Edward visited poverty-stricken areas of Britain and undertook 16 tours to various parts of the empire between 1919 and 1935. On a tour of Canada in 1919, he acquired the Beddingfield Ranch near Pekisco, Alberta. He escaped unharmed when the train he was riding in during a tour of Australia was derailed outside Perth in 1920. Edward's November 1921 visit to India came during the non-cooperation movement protests for Indian self-rule and was marked by riots in Bombay. In 1929, Sir Alexander Leith, a leading conservative in the north of England, persuaded him to make a 3-day visit to the County Durham and Northumberland coalfields, where there was much unemployment. From January to April 1931, the Prince of Wales and his brother Prince George traveled 18,000 miles, 29,000 kilometers, on a tour of South America, steaming out on the ocean liner Oropesa and returning via Paris and an Imperial Airways flight from Paris Le Bourget Airport that landed specially in Windsor Great Park. Though widely traveled, Edward shared a widely held racial prejudice against foreigners and many of the empire's subjects, believing that whites were inherently superior. In 1920, on his visit to Australia, he wrote of Indigenous Australians, "They are the most revolting form of living creatures I've ever seen. They are the lowest known form of human beings and are the nearest thing to monkeys." Nepipok, romances. Before the First World War, a royal match with his second cousin, Princess Victoria Louise of Prussia, was suggested. Nothing came of it, and Victoria Louise married Edward's first cousin, once removed Ernest Augustus, Duke of Brunswick, instead. In 1934, Adolf Hitler, in his ambition to link the British and German royal houses, asked Princess Victoria Louise to arrange a marriage between the 40-year-old Edward and her 17-year-old daughter, Frederica of Hanover, who was at boarding school in England. Her parents refused, due to the age gap, and Frederica instead married Paul of Greece. By 1917, Edward liked to spend time partying in Paris while he was on leave from his regiment on the Western Front. He was introduced to Parisian courtesan Marguerite Alibert, with whom he became infatuated. He wrote her candid letters, which she kept. After about a year, Edward broke off the affair. In 1923, Alibert was acquitted in a spectacular murder trial after she shot her husband in the Savoy Hotel. Desperate efforts were made by the royal household to ensure that Edward's name was not mentioned in connection with the trial, or Alibert. Edward's womanizing and reckless behavior during the 1920s and 1930s worried Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, King George V, and those close to the prince. George V was disappointed by his son's failure to settle down in life, disgusted by his affairs with married women, and reluctant to see him inherit the crown. "After I am dead," George said, "the boy will ruin himself in 12 months." George V favored his second son Albert, Bertie, and Albert's daughter Elizabeth, Lilibet, later King George VI and Queen Elizabeth II, respectively. He told a courtier, "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." In 1929, Time magazine reported that Edward teased Albert's wife, also named Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, by calling her Queen Elizabeth. The magazine asked if she did not sometimes wonder how much truth there is in the story that he once said he would renounce his rights upon the death of George V, which would make her nickname come true. In 1930, George V gave Edward the lease of Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park. There, he continued his relationships with a series of married women, including Freda Dudley Ward and Lady Furness, the American wife of a British peer, who introduced the prince to her friend and fellow American Wallis Simpson. Simpson had divorced her first husband, U.S. Navy officer Win Spencer, in 1927. Her second husband, Ernest Simpson, was a British-American businessman. Wallis Simpson and the Prince of Wales, it is generally accepted, became lovers, while Lady Furness traveled abroad, although the prince adamantly insisted to his father that he was not having an affair with her and that it was not appropriate to describe her as his mistress. Edward's relationship with Simpson, however, further weakened his poor relationship with his father. Although his parents met Simpson at Buckingham Palace in 1935, they later refused to receive her. Edward's affair with an American divorcee led to such grave concern that the couple were followed by members of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, who examined in secret the nature of their relationship. An undated report detailed a visit by the couple to an antique shop, where the proprietor later noted that the lady seemed to have POW, Prince of Wales, completely under her thumb. The prospect of having an American divorcee with a questionable past having such sway over the heir apparent led to anxiety among government and establishment figures. Topic: Reign. George V died on the 20th of January 1936, and Edward ascended the throne as Edward VIII. The next day, accompanied by Simpson, he broke with custom by watching the proclamation of his own accession from a window of St. James's Palace. He became the first monarch of the British Empire to fly in an aircraft when he flew from Sandringham to London for his accession council. Edward caused unease in government circles with actions that were interpreted as interference in political matters. His comment during a tour of depressed villages in South Wales that something must be done for the unemployed coal miners was seen as an attempt to guide government policy, though he had not proposed any remedy or change in policy. Government ministers were reluctant to send confidential documents and state papers to Fort Belvedere, because it was clear that Edward was paying little attention to them, and it was feared that Simpson and other house guests might read them, improperly or inadvertently revealing government secrets. Edward's unorthodox approach to his role also extended to the coinage that bore his image. He broke with the tradition that the profile portrait of each successive monarch faced in the direction opposite to that of his or her predecessor. Edward insisted that he face left, as his father had done, to show the parting in his hair. Only a handful of test coins were struck before the abdication, and all are very rare. When George VI succeeded to the throne, he also faced left, to maintain the tradition by suggesting that, had any further coins been minted featuring Edward's portrait, they would have shown him facing right. On the 16th of July 1936, George Andrew McMahon produced a loaded revolver as Edward rode on horseback at Constitution Hill, near Buckingham Palace. Police spotted the gun and pounced on him. He was quickly arrested. McMahon alleged at his trial that a foreign power had approached him to kill Edward, that he had informed MI5 of the plan, and that he was merely seeing the plan through to help MI5 catch the real culprits. The court rejected the claims and sent him to jail for a year for intent to alarm. It is now thought that McMahon had indeed been in contact with MI5, but the veracity of the remainder of his claims remains debatable. In August and September, Edward and Simpson cruised the eastern Mediterranean on the steam yacht Nayland. By October, it was becoming clear that the new king planned to marry Simpson, especially when divorce proceedings between the Simpsons were brought at Ipswich Assizes. Although gossip about his affair was widespread in the United States, the British media kept silent voluntarily, and the general public knew nothing until early December. Topic: Abdication. On the 16th of November 1936, Edward invited Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to Buckingham Palace and expressed his desire to marry Simpson when she became free to remarry. Baldwin informed him that his subjects would deem the marriage morally unacceptable, largely because remarriage after divorce was opposed by the Church of England, and the people would not tolerate Simpson as queen. As king, Edward was the titular head of the church, and the clergy expected him to support the church's teachings. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, was vocal in insisting that Edward must go. Edward proposed an alternative solution of a morganatic marriage, in which he would remain king, but Simpson would not become queen consort. She would enjoy some lesser title instead, and any children they might have would not inherit the throne. This was supported by senior politician Winston Churchill in principle, and some historians suggest that he conceived the plan. In any event, it was ultimately rejected by the British cabinet, as well as other Dominion governments. The other government's views were sought pursuant to the Statute of Westminster 1931, which provided in part that any alteration in the law touching the succession to the throne or the royal style and titles shall hereafter require the assent as well of the parliaments of all the dominions as of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. The Prime Ministers of Australia, Joseph Lyons, Canada, Mackenzie King, and South Africa, J.B.M. Hertzog, made clear their opposition to the king marrying a divorcee. Their Irish counterpart, Eamon de Valera, expressed indifference and detachment, while the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Michael Joseph Savage, having never heard of Simpson before, vacillated in disbelief. Faced with this opposition, Edward at first responded that there were not many people in Australia, and their opinion did not matter. Edward informed Baldwin that he would abdicate if he could not marry Simpson. Baldwin then presented Edward with three options: give up the idea of marriage, marry against his minister's wishes, or abdicate. It was clear that Edward was not prepared to give up Simpson, and he knew that if he married against the advice of his ministers, he would cause the government to resign, prompting a constitutional crisis. He chose to abdicate. Edward duly signed the instruments of abdication at Fort Belvedere on the 10th of December 1936 in the presence of his younger brothers, Prince Albert, Duke of York, next in line for the throne, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and Prince George, Duke of Kent. The document included these words: "Declare my irrevocable determination to renounce the throne for myself and for my descendants, and my desire that effect should be given to this instrument of abdication immediately." The next day, the last act of his reign, was the royal assent to His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act 1936. As required by the Statute of Westminster, all the dominions had already consented to the abdication. On the night of 11th of December 1936, Edward, now reverted to the title and style of a prince, explained his decision to abdicate in a worldwide BBC radio broadcast. He said, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." He added that the decision was mine and mine alone. The other person, most nearly concerned, has tried up to the last to persuade me to take a different course. Edward departed Britain for Austria the following day. He was unable to join Simpson until her divorce became absolute. Several months later, the Duke of York succeeded to the throne as George VI. Accordingly, George VI's elder daughter, Princess Elizabeth, became heir presumptive. Duke of Windsor. On the 12th of December 1936, at the accession meeting of the British Privy Council, George VI announced his intention to make his brother the Duke of Windsor, with the style of Royal Highness. He wanted this to be the first act of his reign, although the formal documents were not signed until the 8th of March the following year. During the interim, Edward was known as the Duke of Windsor. George VI's decision to create Edward a royal duke ensured that he could neither stand for election to the British House of Commons nor speak on political subjects in the House of Lords. Letters patent dated 27th of May 1937 reconferred the title, style, or attribute of Royal Highness upon the Duke, but specifically stated that his wife and descendants, if any, shall not hold said title or attribute. Some British ministers advised that the reconfirmation was unnecessary since Edward had retained the style automatically, and further that Simpson would automatically obtain the rank of wife of a prince with the style Her Royal Highness. Others maintained that he had lost all royal rank and should no longer carry any royal title or style as an abdicated king, and be referred to simply as Mr. Edward Windsor. On the 14th of April 1937, Attorney General Sir Donald Somervell submitted to Home Secretary Sir John Simon a memorandum summarizing the views of Lord Advocate T.M. Cooper, Parliamentary Counsel Sir Granville Ram, and himself. We incline to the view that on his abdication the Duke of Windsor could not have claimed the right to be described as a Royal Highness. In other words, no reasonable objection could have been taken if the king had decided that his exclusion from the lineal succession excluded him from the right to this title, as conferred by the existing letters patent. The question, however, has to be considered on the basis of the fact that for reasons which are readily understandable, he, with the express approval of His Majesty, enjoys this title and has been referred to as a Royal Highness on a formal occasion and in formal documents. In the light of precedent, it seems clear that the wife of a Royal Highness enjoys the same title unless some appropriate express step can be and is taken to deprive her of it. We came to the conclusion that the wife could not claim this right on any legal basis. The right to use this style or title, in our view, is within the prerogative of His Majesty, and he has the power to regulate it by letters patent generally or in particular circumstances. The Duke married Simpson, who had changed her name by deed poll to Wallace Warfield, her birth surname, in a private ceremony on the 3rd of June 1937 at Château de Candé near Tours, France. When the Church of England refused to sanction the union, a County Durham clergyman, Robert Anderson Jardine, vicar of St. Paul's, Darlington, offered to perform the ceremony, and Edward accepted. George VI forbade members of the royal family to attend, to the lasting resentment of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Edward had particularly wanted his brothers, the Dukes of Gloucester and Kent, and his second cousin, Lord Louis Mountbatten, to attend the ceremony. The French virtuoso organist and composer Marcel Dupré played at the wedding. The denial of the style Royal Highness to the Duchess of Windsor caused further conflict, as did the financial settlement. The government declined to include the Duke or Duchess on the civil list, and the Duke's allowance was paid personally by George VI. Edward compromised his position with his brother by concealing the extent of his financial worth when they informally agreed on the amount of the allowance. Edward's wealth had accumulated from the revenues of the Duchy of Cornwall paid to him as Prince of Wales and ordinarily at the disposal of an incoming king. George also paid Edward for Sandringham House and Balmoral Castle, which were Edward's personal property, inherited from his father, and thus did not automatically pass to George VI on his accession. Edward received approximately £300,000, equivalent to between £21 million and £140 million in 2021 for both residences, which was paid to him in yearly installments. In the early days of George VI's reign, Edward telephoned daily, importuning for money and urging that Wallace be granted the style of Royal Highness, until the harassed king ordered that the calls not be put through. Relations between the Duke of Windsor and the rest of the royal family were strained for decades. Edward had assumed that he would settle in Britain after a year or two of exile in France. King George VI, with the support of Queen Mary and his wife Queen Elizabeth, threatened to cut off Edward's allowance if he returned to Britain without an invitation. Edward became embittered against his mother, Queen Mary, writing to her in 1939, "Your last letter destroyed the last vestige of feeling I had left for you, and has made further normal correspondence between us impossible." In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess visited Nazi Germany against the advice of the British government and met Adolf Hitler at his Berghof retreat in Bavaria. The visit was much publicized by the German media. During the visit, Edward gave full Nazi salutes. In Germany, they were treated like royalty. Members of the aristocracy would bow and curtsy towards her, and she was treated with all the dignity and status that the Duke always wanted, according to royal biographer Andrew Morton in a 2016 BBC interview. The former Austrian ambassador, Count Albert von Mensdorff-Puyi-Dietrichstein, who was also a second cousin once removed and friend of George V, believed that Edward favored German fascism as a bulwark against communism, and even that he initially favored an alliance with Germany. According to the Duke of Windsor, the experience of the unending scenes of horror during the First World War led him to support appeasement. Hitler considered Edward to be friendly towards Germany and thought that Anglo-German relations could have been improved through Edward if it were not for the abdication. Albert Speer quoted Hitler directly, "I am certain through him permanent friendly relations could have been achieved. If he had stayed, everything would have been different. His abdication was a severe loss for us." The Duke and Duchess settled in Paris, leasing a mansion in Boulevard Suchet from late 1938. Second World War. In May 1939, Edward was commissioned by NBC to give a radio broadcast, his first since abdicating, during a visit to the First World War battlefields of Verdun. In it, he appealed for peace, saying, "I am deeply conscious of the presence of the great company of the dead, and I am convinced that could they make their voices heard, they would be with me in what I am about to say. I speak simply as a soldier of the last war whose most earnest prayer it is that such cruel and destructive madness shall never again overtake mankind. There is no land whose people want war." The broadcast was heard across the world by millions. It was widely regarded as supporting appeasement, and the BBC refused to broadcast it. It was broadcast outside the United States on shortwave radio and was reported in full by British broadsheet newspapers. On the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, the Duke and Duchess were brought back to Britain by Louis Mountbatten on board HMS Kelly, and Edward, although he held the rank of Field Marshal, was made a Major General attached to the British military mission in France. In February 1940, the German ambassador in The Hague, Count Julius von Zech-Berkersrode, claimed that Edward had leaked the Allied war plans for the defense of Belgium, which the Duke later denied. When Germany invaded the north of France in May 1940, the Windsors fled south, first to Biarritz, then in June to France-Ouest Spain. In July, they moved to Portugal, where they lived at first in the home of Ricardo Espírito Santo, a Portuguese banker with both British and German contacts. Under the code name Operation Willy, Nazi agents, principally Walter Schellenberg, plotted unsuccessfully to persuade the Duke to leave Portugal and return to Spain, kidnapping him if necessary. Lord Caldecott wrote a warning to Winston Churchill, who by this point was Prime Minister, that the Duke is well known to be pro-Nazi, and he may become a center of intrigue. Churchill threatened Edward with a court-martial if he did not return to British soil. In July 1940, Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas. The Duke and Duchess left Lisbon on the 1st of August aboard the American export line steamship Excalibur, which was specially diverted from its usual direct course to New York City so that they could be dropped off at Bermuda on the 9th. They left Bermuda for Nassau on the Canadian National Steamship Company vessel Lady Somers on the 15th of August, arriving 2 days later. Edward did not enjoy being governor and privately referred to the islands as a third-class British colony. The British Foreign Office strenuously objected when Edward and Wallis planned to cruise aboard a yacht belonging to Swedish magnate Axel Wenner-Gren, whom British and American intelligence wrongly believed to be a close friend of Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring. Edward was praised for his efforts to combat poverty on the islands, although he was as contemptuous of the Bahamians as he was of most non-white peoples of the empire. He said of Etienne Dupuche, the editor of the Nassau Daily Tribune, "It must be remembered that Dupuche is more than half Negro, and due to the peculiar mentality of this race, they seem unable to rise to prominence without losing their equilibrium." He was praised, even by Dupuche, for his resolution of civil unrest over low wages in Nassau in 1942, even though he blamed the trouble on mischief-makers, communists, and men of Central European Jewish descent who had secured jobs as a pretext for obtaining a deferment of draft. He resigned from the post on the 16th of March 1945. Many historians have suggested that Adolf Hitler was prepared to reinstate Edward as king in the hope of establishing a fascist puppet government in Britain after Operation Sea Lion. It is widely believed that the Duke and Duchess sympathized with fascism before and during the Second World War and were moved to the Bahamas to minimize their opportunities to act on those feelings. In 1940, he said, "In the past 10 years, Germany has totally reorganized the order of its society. Countries which were unwilling to accept such a reorganization of society and its concomitant sacrifices should direct their policies accordingly." During the occupation of France, the Duke asked the German Wehrmacht forces to place guards at his Paris and Riviera homes. They did so. In December 1940, Edward gave Fulton Orsler of Liberty magazine an interview at Government House in Nassau. Orsler conveyed its content to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in a private meeting at the White House on the 23rd of December 1940. The interview was published on 22nd of March 1941, and in it Edward was reported to have said that, Hitler was the right and logical leader of the German people, and that the time was coming for President Roosevelt to mediate a peace settlement. Edward protested that he had been misquoted and misinterpreted. The Allies became sufficiently disturbed by German plots revolving around Edward that President Roosevelt ordered covert surveillance of the Duke and Duchess when they visited Palm Beach, Florida, in April 1941. Duke Karl Alexander of Württemberg, then a monk in an American monastery, had told the Federal Bureau of Investigation that Wallace had slept with the German ambassador in London. Joachim von Ribbentrop, in 1936, had remained in constant contact with him and had continued to leak secrets. Author Charles Hyam claimed that Anthony Blunt, an MI5 agent and Soviet spy, acting on orders from the British royal family, made a successful secret trip to Schloss Friedrichshof in Allied-occupied Germany towards the end of the war to retrieve sensitive letters between the Duke of Windsor and Adolf Hitler and other leading Nazis. What is certain is that George VI sent the royal librarian Owen Morshed, accompanied by Blunt, then working part-time in the Royal Library, as well as for British intelligence, to Friedrichshof in March 1945 to secure papers relating to Victoria, German Empress, the eldest child of Queen Victoria. Looters had stolen part of the castle's archive, including surviving letters between daughter and mother, as well as other valuables, some of which were recovered in Chicago after the war. The papers rescued by Morshed and Blunt, and those returned by the American authorities from Chicago, were deposited in the Royal Archives. In the late 1950s, documents recovered by U.S. troops in Marburg, Germany, in May 1945, since titled the Marburg Files, were published following more than a decade of suppression, enhancing theories of Edward's sympathies for Nazi ideologies. After the war, Edward admitted in his memoirs that he admired the Germans, but he denied being pro-Nazi. Of Hitler he wrote, "The Führer struck me as a somewhat ridiculous figure, with his theatrical posturings and his bombastic pretensions." In the 1950s, journalist Frank Giles heard the Duke blame British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden for helping to precipitate the war through his treatment of Mussolini. That's what Eden did. He helped to bring on the war. And of course Roosevelt and the Jews. During the 1960s, Edward said privately to a friend, Patrick Balfour, 3rd Baron Kinross, "I never thought Hitler was such a bad chap." Topuk, later life. At the end of the war, the couple returned to France and spent the remainder of their lives essentially in retirement, as Edward never held another official role. Letters written by Kenneth de Courcy to the Duke, dated between 1946 and 1949, extracts of which were published in 2009, suggest a scheme where Edward would return to England and place himself in a position for a possible regency. The health of George VI was failing, and de Courcy was concerned about the influence of the Mountbatten family over the young Princess Elizabeth. De Courcy suggested the Duke buy a working agricultural estate within an easy drive of London in order to gain favor with the British public and make himself available should the king become incapacitated. The Duke, however, hesitated, and the king recovered from his surgery. De Courcy also mentioned the possibility of the British occupation zone in Germany becoming a kingdom with Edward becoming king. Nothing came of the suggestion. Edward's allowance was supplemented by government favors and illegal currency trading. The city of Paris provided the Duke with a house at 4 Rue du Champ-d'Entraînement, on the Neuilly-sur-Seine side of the Bois de Boulogne, for a nominal rent. The French government also exempted him from paying income tax, and the couple were able to buy goods duty-free through the British Embassy and the military commissary. In 1952, they bought and renovated a weekend country retreat, Le Moulin de la Tuilerie at Gif-sur-Yvette, the only property the couple ever owned themselves. In 1951, Edward produced a memoir, A King's Story, ghostwritten by Charles Murphy, in which he expressed disagreement with liberal politics. The royalties from the book added to their income. Edward and Wallace effectively took on the role of celebrities and were regarded as part of café society in the 1950s and 1960s. They hosted parties and shuttled between Paris and New York. Gore Vidal, who met the Windsors socially, reported on the vacuity of the Duke's conversation. The couple doted on the pug dogs they kept. In June 1953, instead of attending the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, his niece, in London, Edward and Wallis watched the ceremony on television in Paris. Edward said that it was contrary to precedent for a sovereign or former sovereign to attend any coronation of another. He was paid to write articles on the ceremony for the Sunday Express and Woman's Home Companion, as well as a short book, The Crown and the People, 1902 to 1953. In 1955, the couple visited President Dwight D. Eisenhower at the White House. The couple appeared on Edward R. Murrow's television interview show, Person to Person, in 1956, and in a 50-minute BBC television interview in 1970. On the 4th of April of that year, President Richard Nixon invited them as guests of honor to a dinner at the White House with Chief Justice Warren E. Burger, Charles Lindbergh, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Arnold Palmer, George H.W. Bush, and Frank Borman. The royal family never fully accepted the Duchess. Queen Mary refused to receive her formally. However, Edward sometimes met his mother and his brother, George VI. He attended George's funeral in 1952. Mary remained angry with Edward and indignant over his marriage to Wallis. "To give up all this for that," she said. In 1965, the Duke and Duchess returned to London. They were visited by his niece, Elizabeth II, his sister-in-law, Princess Marina, Duchess of Kent, and his sister Mary, Princess Royal and Countess of Harewood. A week later, the Princess Royal died, and they attended her memorial service. In 1966, Edward gave the journalist Georg Stefan Troller a TV interview in German. He answered questions about his abdication. In 1967, the Duke and Duchess joined the royal family for the centenary of Queen Mary's birth. The last royal ceremony Edward attended was the funeral of Princess Marina in 1968. He declined an invitation from Elizabeth II to attend the investiture of Charles, Prince of Wales, in 1969, replying that Charles would not want his aged great-uncle there. In the 1960s, Edward's health deteriorated. Michael E. DeBakey operated on him in Houston for an aneurysm of the abdominal aorta in December 1964, and Sir Stuart Duke Elder treated a detached retina in his left eye in February 1965. In late 1971, Edward, who was a smoker from an early age, was diagnosed with throat cancer and underwent cobalt therapy. On the 18th of May 1972, Queen Elizabeth II visited the Duke and Duchess of Windsor while on a state visit to France. She spoke with Edward for 15 minutes, but only Wallis appeared with the royal party for a photo call as Edward was too ill. Topic: Death and Legacy. On the 28th of May 1972, 10 days after Elizabeth's visit, Edward died at his home in Paris. His body was returned to Britain, lying in state at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The funeral service took place in the chapel on the 5th of June in the presence of the Queen, the royal family, and the Duchess of Windsor, who stayed at Buckingham Palace during her visit. He was buried in the royal burial ground behind the royal mausoleum of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert at Frogmore. Until a 1965 agreement with the Queen, the Duke and Duchess had planned for a burial in a cemetery plot they had purchased at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, where Wallis's father was interred. Frail and suffering increasingly from dementia, Wallis died in 1986 and was buried alongside her husband. In the view of historians, such as Philip Williamson writing in 2007, the popular perception in the 21st century that the abdication was driven by politics rather than religious morality is false and arises because divorce has become much more common and socially acceptable. To modern sensibilities, the religious restrictions that prevented Edward from continuing as king while planning to marry Wallis Simpson seem, wrongly, to provide insufficient explanation for his abdication. To Honors and Arms. British Commonwealth and Empire Honors. K.G. Knight of the Garter, 23rd of June 1910. ISO, Companion of the Imperial Service Order, 23rd of June 1910. Military Cross, 3rd of June 1916. GCMG, Grandmaster and Knight Grand Cross of the Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George, 1917. GBE, Grandmaster and Knight Grand Cross of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, 1917. ADC, Personal Aide de Camp, 3rd of June 1919. PC, Privy Councillor of the United Kingdom, 2nd of March 1920. GCVO, Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, 13th March 1920. GC, Extra Knight Grand Commander of the Most Exalted Order of the Star of India, 10th of October 1921. GCIE, Extra Knight Grand Commander of the Most Eminent Order of the Indian Empire, 10th of October 1921. Recipient of the Royal Victorian Chain, 1921 KT, Extra Knight of the Most Ancient and Most Noble Order of the Thistle, 23rd of June 1922 GCSJ. Bailiff Grand Cross of the Venerable Order of St. John, 12th of June 1926. KSTJ, Knight of Justice of the Most Venerable Order of St. John, 2nd June 1917 KP. Additional Knight of the Most Illustrious Order of St. Patrick, 3rd of June 1927 PC. Privy Councillor of Canada, 2nd of August 1927. GCB, Knight Grand Cross of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath, 1936. FRS, Royal Fellow of the Royal Society. Big Foreign Honours. Grand Cross of the House Order of the Wendish Crown, with Crown in Or, 1st of May 1911. Knight of the Grand Ducal Hessian Order of the Golden Lion, 23rd of June 1911. Knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece, 22nd of June 1912. Grand Cross of the National Order of the Legion of Honor, August 1912. Knight of the Order of the Elephant, 17th of March 1914. Grand Cross of the Royal Norwegian Order of St. Olav, with Collar, 6th of April 1914. Knight of the Supreme Order of the Most Holy Annunciation, 21st of June 1915. Croix de Guerre, 1915. Knight of the Order of St. George, 3rd Class, 16th of May 1916. Knight of the Order of the Royal House of Chakri, 16th of August 1917. Order of Michael the Brave, 1st Class, 1918. War Merit Cross, 1919. Grand Cordon of the Royal Order of Muhammad Ali, 1922. Knight of the Royal Order of the Seraphim, 12th of November 1923. Collar of the Order of Carol Thirst, 1924. Order of Merit, 1st Class. 1925 Grand Cross of the Order of the Condor of the Andes. 1931 Grand Cross of the Order of the Sun of Peru, 1931. Grand Cross of the Sash of the Two Orders, 25th of April 1931, during his visit to Lisbon. Grand Cross of the National Order of the Southern Cross, 1933. Grand Cross of the Order of St. Agatha, 1935. Top military ranks. 22nd of June 1911, Midshipman, Royal Navy, 17th of March 1913. Lieutenant, Royal Navy, 18th of November 1914. Lieutenant, 1st Battalion, Grenadier Guards, British Army. First World War, Flanders and Italy. 10th of March 1916. Captain, British Army, 1918. Temporary Major, British Army. 15th April 1919. Colonel, British Army. 8th of July 1919. Captain, Royal Navy, 5th December 1922. Group. Captain, Royal Air Force, 1st September 1930. Vice Admiral, Royal Navy. Lieutenant General, British Army. Air Marshal, Royal Air Force. 1st January 1935. Admiral, Royal Navy. General, British Army. Air Chief Marshal, Royal Air Force. 21st of January 1936. Admiral of the Fleet, Royal Navy. Field Marshal, British Army. Marshal of the Royal Air Force, 3rd September 1939. Major General, British Army. Edward's coat of arms as the Prince of Wales was the Royal Coat of Arms of the United Kingdom, differenced with a label of 3 points argent, with an escutcheon representing Wales surmounted by a coronet. As sovereign, he bore the royal arms undifferenced. After his abdication, he used the arms again differenced by a label of 3 points argent, but this time with the center point bearing an imperial crown. Topic. See also: Cultural depictions of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. Abandoned coronation of Edward VIII. List of prime ministers of Edward VIII. No differences. Bibliography. Bloch, Michael, 1982. The Duke of Windsor's War. London, Weidenfeld and Nicholson. ISBN 029794778. Bradford, Sarah, 1989. King George VI. London, Weidenfeld and Nicholson. ISBN 02977966674. Donaldson, Francis, 1974. Edward VIII. London, Weidenfeld and Nicholson. ISBN 02977667879. Godfrey, Rupert, editor, 1998. Letters from a Prince, Edward to Mrs. Freda Dudley Ward, 1918 to 1921. Little Brown and Co. ISBN 07515259001. Parker, John, 1988. King of Fools. New York, St. Martin's Press. ISBN 0202598X. Pimlott, Ben, 2001. The Queen, Elizabeth II and the Monarchy. London, HarperCollins. ISBN 0-2554941. Roberts, Andrew, edited by Antonia Fraser 2000. The House of Windsor, London, Cassell & Co. ISBN 0304-35466. Wheeler Bennett, Sir John, 1958. King George VI, London, Macmillan. Williams, Susan, 2003. The People's King, The True Story of the Abdication. London, Allen Lane. ISBN 9780-71399572. Windsor, the Duke of 1951. A King's Story, London, Cassell & Co. Ziegler, Philip, 1991. King Edward VIII, The Official Biography. New York, Alfred A. Knopf. ISBN 0394-577302. External links. Archival material relating to Edward VIII. UK National Archives. Portraits of Prince Edward, Duke of Windsor at the National Portrait Gallery. London newspaper clippings about Edward VIII in the 20th century. Press archives of the ZBW. Edward VIII at the official website of the British monarchy. Edward VIII at BBC History.